Here we are. Hi, everyone, guys. My name is Luca. I'm a community manager of London JavaScript. Tonight we are going to talk about Angular 2 and Firebase with Sara, that is with her colleagues directly from Google. She's a developer advocate for Google. And again, tonight she will show us how powerful is Angular 2 and Firebase, and definitely we can learn more. If you have any question during the session, please send a tweet mentioning at London_JS, and at the end of the session, I will ask to Sara and her team to answer all of your questions. So, guys, it's completely up to you, and good luck with the presentation.
Thank you. All right. Hey, everybody. We're super excited to be here to tell you all about Firebase and Angular 2. We're just going to get started by introducing ourselves. So I'm Sara. We're coming to you all the way from San Francisco. So it is Tuesday morning where we are. I'm a developer advocate on the Google Cloud team, and I'm here with two of my colleagues. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, I'm David East. I work as a developer advocate on the Firebase team, and I occasionally party with the people on the Angular team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's where I come in. I'm Jeff Cross from the Angular team, software engineer on the team for a few years now, working on Angular 2 now that we just released to beta.
Awesome. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen and jumping right into the slides. So can everybody see this?
Yes, we can.
I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay. All right. So hey, everyone. We're super excited to be here. This is where you can find us on Twitter. So if you have any questions after the event, we'll take a look there. You can find us on Twitter there. And today we're going to talk about how Angular 2 makes Firebase easy, how the two technologies work really well together, and how you can use them to build awesome applications. Just a quick show of hands or a show of comments in the webinar. How many of you have heard of Firebase before? We'll be watching the comment stream. And how many of you have used Angular 2? It's currently in beta. All right, so I'm going to jump in by first introducing you to what Firebase is, in case you haven't heard about it. So Firebase is a platform for building extraordinary applications. What does this mean exactly? Well, Firebase has a couple different features that make it easy to build your application. The first of which, and this is my favorite, is the real-time database. So Firebase has a NoSQL JSON database where every piece of data in Firebase has its own URL. We've got three clients. We've got a JavaScript client for the web, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, and then an iOS and Android client for mobile. So it makes it really easy to build cross-platform applications. Second feature Firebase has for you is user authentication. So instead of having to deal with OAuth, we handle user authentication in each of our client libraries for you. So you can authenticate users with Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, Google+, or basic email password authentication. And we're going to be showing you how that works in a demo a little bit later on. And then we also have a static hosting service. So you can deploy your static app through the command line with just one command, Firebase deploy, and your app is live on its own firebaseapp.com URL. So the really cool thing about Firebase's real-time database is that all of the data updates in real time. So this means that any connected client to your application will see changes to the data synchronized as they happen. They don't have to refresh the page or pull to refresh on mobile. They're immediately notified of any changes to the data. So you can see in this awesome GIF how that works. So now, actually, I'm going to jump to some code real quick. So I'm going to exit the presentation. Mix those slides up. So I'm going to show you how this works. I'm going to pull up my Firebase app dashboard in the console. So this is a Firebase application that I own called FP-A2, Firebase and Angular 2. There's no data in it yet because we haven't added anything, but I'm going to show you quickly how this looks. I'm just going to pull up the console here and clear that out. And for those of you who didn't know, there's some awesome ES 2015 features which are already available in Chrome, which David pointed out to me yesterday. So I'm going to make use of those now. So the first thing I mentioned is to store data in Firebase, you need to create a reference to your Firebase data, and you do that by passing it a URL. So I'm going to say const ref equals new Firebase, and I'm going to pass it this URL. And one way I can write data to my Firebase is through our set method. So set will update the contents of the Firebase with whatever you pass it. So I'm going to pass it a string. I'm going to say ref.set hello London, and we can see that that changed up there, which is pretty cool. Another way to write data to Firebase is through our push method, and push is really useful if you've got a lot of people writing to the same node at the same time. It'll create a unique ID every time a new piece of data is added. So if instead I say ref.push, we can see that it created this unique ID, and if I run that again, it didn't overwrite what was there before. So we're going to be using push later on in the demo. So that's the basics of writing data to Firebase, and if you want to read data back from Firebase, you just need to attach an asynchronous callback to your Firebase reference. So here I can say ref.onValue, and this returns a snapshot. Since Firebase is a real-time data stream, this snapshot is what your data looks like at that point in time. And here I'll just log that to the console. I can get the value of that by saying snapshot.val. And we can see it logged the contents of my Firebase. But the really cool thing about this is that this is going to be triggered anytime that data changes. So if I go in here and change the data, this is also an editor. If I say hi again, we can see that it's logged the new value of my Firebase data to the console, which is pretty cool. I didn't have to write any extra code to make that happen. So that's just the basics of reading and writing data to Firebase. Now I'm going to turn it over to David to dive into the Angular component of this. So here we go. Let me go back to presentation mode.
So yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff. Sara showed you that Firebase makes really easy, but it didn't actually work right out of the box right away with Angular 1. So we actually had to do a lot of work. So we had to do a lot of work internally. So the external API that developers use was really easy. So we went out and we actually made a library with Angular and Firebase called Angular Fire, which has done pretty well so far. It has over 1,600 stars on GitHub, and if you haven't started, you totally should because it's awesome. And if you want to contribute, we have like well over 150 contributors. So there's tons of open issues. So you're more than welcome to jump on in. But we worked really hard on this, and there are three main reasons where we had to work, and that's dealing with digest, array handling, and promises. So with digest, this is sort of your age-old. Angular doesn't know about external. Angular 1 doesn't know about external APIs. So right here with Firebase, as Sara showed you, you can say ref.onValue, and then you get your data synchronization inside that callback. Well, if you assign scope.object to that value, Angular wouldn't really know about it. So we'd have to wrap it in timeout or scope.apply or something like that. So, it would refresh the digest loop. And that was sort of a pain. So that was actually the first reason why we really knew we needed integration. And the second is that everything in Angular 1 really expects to come back as an array. So when you're doing ng repeat and stuff like that, it works best if you're dealing with an array. And Firebase, is a JSON database, which means all of your data is always JSON, not an array. So we had to actually coerce our data to work as an array, which doesn't sound super complicated, but when you think about it, an array works with a index-based, and our data works with unique IDs. And index-based stuff with real-time data means it's constantly like clobbering and writing over each other, typical race conditions. And so we had to write all this stuff to make sure that the array would stay in sync without hitting any of those race conditions. And then another issue is with promises. So if you were like me, when you first started working with Angular 1, you were like, hey, what are promises? And then you're like, these seem kind of weird. But then you saw like, oh, this is much better than dealing with nested callbacks, like in this nice modeling of asynchronous data flow. And you started using them, and you're like, this is totally awesome. But there actually were some issues with promises and with real-time data specifically. So promises guarantee that you will get a call back like one time. And that's not really that great for us because we want data to come back in a stream. And so we had to sort of do some weird things with alerting people when data had been loaded, but then keeping it synchronized, keeping the whole entire array synchronized otherwise. And so it was kind of like, it's how we could work with Angular, but not exactly totally, it didn't totally fit our model. And what's really cool is that Angular 2 has all these new features that actually don't really make these, that just completely makes these things go away. And the first two are zones and change detection. So we earlier talked about how we were dealing with digest and how you had to wrap everything in timeout or scope.apply just to get your template and stuff to update. And with zones and change detection, you don't have to do that at all. So zones is essentially this asynchronous execution context. And essentially it lets you know when asynchronous actions have completed. So if you've clicked a button or if you had an XHR call, or in our case, a WebSocket on message event, when those have completed, zones just kind of says like, hey, I'm done here. And then change detection is kind of like, thanks, let's do our job now and let's like see what has changed. And that way your template gets updated. And what that means is that there's nothing that you have to do. If you just say, ref.onValue like we showed earlier, we didn't have to wrap it in anything. It just works out the box, which is so much easier.
And one other thing about zones, so David mentioned they're a context for asynchronous operations. What that also gives us is context for errors. So if there's an async operation, like you start an XML HTTP request and something goes wrong later, normally that stack trace would be lost. Like you would get the callback stack trace, but you wouldn't know what request it was associated with. But with zones, you can actually have a continuous stack trace showing, okay, from this async start to this async end, here's everything that happened, and you can figure out where it went wrong. And zones are so cool in Angular, we think, that we've started the process of getting them standardized as part of JavaScript. And last week, they made it to stage 0 of the TC39 standardization process to make it into the language. So that's really exciting.
Yeah, and zones are super sweet. Actually, when I gave the first Angular 2 talk, Mishko came up on stage at the end to field questions. And then someone just casually mentioned zones, and he was like, no. Zones are the bee's knees. And ever since using them, I've realized I was like, these are the bee's knees. These are awesome. So if anyone asks you what zones are, you can just let them know that they're the bee's knees. But so the second thing, though, is pipes. And so pipes are like filters in Angular 1, except that they kind of like grew up, went to college, did some steroids, got super jacked, and are like so much more powerful now. And so they're more than just the ability to change the format of something, which they can still totally do, but they also can manage state. So what we've actually kind of experimented with is we created a Firebase pipe where you can take that Firebase URL that Sara had showed you earlier, and it will just take that data and pipe it into your template. So it will, whenever that data changes, it automatically changes in your template. And there's actually no code to write in your component or anything like that. It just binds directly based upon your URL. And it didn't matter what format it was. So in the case of array handling, like before, we didn't need an array. We actually could just easily bind that object there. And we could even do it in a list. And it really was a lot easier than having to create an entire synchronized array. And lastly, when we talked about before with dealing with promises, or promises only give you a callback one time, well, observables is really actually what we wanted before. And promises, like we said, it's a guarantee you're going to get callback one time. And observables also are a great way of modeling asynchronous data flow, but they're going to fire off as a continuous stream. So it's like a promise, but it continues to fire off. And that is really what we were looking for when we were dealing with Angular Fire 1. And just like in Angular 1, how promises have all these nice little hooks, like dealing with resolver functions in the router, that Angular 2 has a lot of great places too, that if you use an observable, it's really going to fit great with the framework. And so this is like a really nice pairing, not only with Firebase and observables, but with observables in Angular 2.
So David talked about some really awesome new features in Angular 2, which I'm excited about. Now we're going to see how you can use those in your applications with Firebase. So there's a new library available. It's in super early alpha, as you can see here, called Angular Fire 2, which basically lets you use Angular 2 and Firebase, making use of all the cool features of Angular 2, like observables. You can check it out on GitHub. Definitely welcome contributions if you want to take it for a spin. Just need to install it through npm. So npm install -- save Angular Fire 2.
And by early alpha, that means everything that's there now will change with every release probably. Like we already have planned to break everything that's in the current release. But we'd love people to start trying it and giving feedback on things that are easy to use and awkward. But yeah, I expect lots of breaking changes as we go.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a very early alpha library. And to show you how it works right now, we are going to write some code. Before we do that, I'm just going to give you a little intro to the things we're going to be using to build this application. So what are we going to build? We're going to build a social, local, real-time chat application. Lots of buzzwords.
I'd invest in that.
I already started the funding.
Oh, wow. This is exciting. It's also going to have internationalization support. So you're probably wondering, what do I mean by internationalization support? Well, most of the people on this hangout are in London, I believe. And last time I traveled to London, I noticed there were a couple words that were different between American English and British English. Here's some examples. So I thought it'd be cool if we built a chat app that it'll have authentication with GitHub, so you can sign in with your GitHub account. And then if you happen to type one of these words that translates between American and British English, it'll translate that word for you.
It's actually true. I was just hanging out with Paul Lewis, and he is from London. And when I was in line for something, I was on my phone, and then he wasn't moving forward, and then he yelled at me. It was like, "David, mind the queue," and I had no idea what he was talking about.
Yeah, there's lots of words like that. Yeah, when I was in London for Angular Connect, I confused black pudding for chocolate. This is indeed not chocolate, it's sausage. So what we're going to use to build this application is the Angular CLI, also super early alpha. But I definitely recommend trying it out if you get the chance. Basically what the Angular CLI does is it generates a scaffolding for your Angular application for you, and it also comes with a lot of built-in generators. So if you want to generate new components, since your application should be split into a couple different components, you can do that really easily using the CLI generator. So to install it, again, just through npm install Angular CLI, and then ng new, whatever you want to call your app, will generate a new app for you with a basic application template. Then you can cd into your apps directory, and you can run it locally with ng-serve. Really easy to get started. And to instantiate Firebase in the application, I'm going to have Jeff talk about this briefly.
Sure. So if you're familiar with Angular 1, you know that we have a bootstrap method that you could call like this, but it's a little bit different here. And in this way, we're calling bootstrap with a component as the first argument and then an array as the second argument. So an important thing to know about Angular 2 is it's all based on components. The way you construct your app and put things together is based on components and nesting components and setting routes as components. Everything is based on components. So we still have things like services, and we still have dependency injection that complement your components. And that's what the second argument of the bootstrap method is here. This is how we tell dependency injection how to configure things that our components will need. And dependency injection, if that's a new term to you, that's Angular's way of registering things that need to be injected in other places, like a service that could handle some kind of data, like it could handle login. In this case, we're taking two providers from the Angular Fire library called default Firebase, which sets up the URL for the Firebase that we'll be using throughout our whole application. And then a second thing, which is just a constant that provides some general providers from the Angular Fire library. So we've got something here that we're going to show in context as we dive into the code of the app, showing how an observable works inside the application. So in this case, we're creating an observable from calling the Firebase web SDK directly. We're getting a hold of this messages path on our SDK and then pushing an object to it that just has a message and user field. And by using this promise observable constructor, this will actually return an observable that waits for this promise return from the Firebase SDK to complete, and then will emit values to whatever's listening to it.
Cool, and then I was just going to talk about pipes a bit more. As you heard from David, pipes are the grown-up version of Angular 1's filters. And they transform the data as input into whatever you want the output to be. So you're probably familiar with stateless pipes. They can transform data, but they don't remember anything about it. So an example of this is the date transform pipe. If you want to nicely format a date, you can use it for that. What we want to focus on is stateful pipes, specifically the async pipe, which can receive a promise or observable as input, and then it maintains a subscription to that input whenever the data changes, which is going to be really useful with Firebase. So we can do things like this with our data from Firebase, which you'll see in a moment. So we can say ng for message of messages. So we can loop through all the messages that are being returned from that /messages URL in Firebase and create an observable to that using the async pipe.
So on the left side of this, so we see the pipe character here and async on the right. Messages as it goes into that is just an observable, and so an observable itself doesn't have any values. But then when it comes out the other side of the async pipe, it's actually a list, an array of messages that then Angular knows how to look at it and do something with it.
Which was like in like super early Angular 1 where it would auto unwrap promises for you. Mm-hmm. While as awesome as it was, did not work super well.
Yeah, it turned into a lot of problems.
With two-way data binding, yeah.
So now we're going to take a look at some code. I'm going to jump on over here to my terminal. And I've got this app that I built with Angular CLI. As I mentioned before, it's a real-time social local chat app. So I'm going to run ng-serve to get this up and running locally. And we can see it's live on localhost 4200. And we can see this is what the app looks like here. So I'm already logged in using GitHub. It's a chat app. I can choose my language preference. I'm going to select American English since I'm here in the US. And I'm going to actually open up my Firebase dashboard side by side here. And I'm going to clear out what was in there before so that we can see the magic of Firebase and Angular. Oops. Let me pull that up side by side. And if I say hello in here, hit send, you can see it was translated. And the message was added to Firebase in real time using push under the hood. So it created this push ID. So every time I add a new message, it'll be given a new push ID. And we can see it maps to my GitHub username. One cool thing is that I can control which parts of the template I see if I'm logged in or logged out. So if I log out, you can see that it changes right away. I can log back in with GitHub, and we can see everything is displayed there. So that's a quick little demo of the app, and now we kind of want to walk you through some of the code for it. So I'm going to hop on over to Sublime. Hoping everyone can see that. I'll make it a little bit bigger just to be sure. So the first thing I want to talk about is the application structure, which was generated for me when I created a new app with the Angular CLI, so ng-new. So my app is split into two components. I've got a login component, and the user's authentication state is shared across the application, as you saw before in the demo. So I can detect whether they're logged in and display specific content based on that. And we're using Firebase's authentication methods directly in that login component, which you'll see in a second. And then the messages component is where I send the message to Firebase. And then the app has two services. One is the translator service, which you saw in action before. So that just has a couple keywords, and if you happen to type one of those into the chat, it will translate it. And then the submit handler just handles sending the form data to Firebase, sending the message and the user's GitHub username. So looking at some of the files specifically, so this is the application.ts file. We're using TypeScript here. And as Jeff mentioned before, this is where we instantiate our Firebase URL. So this is the default Firebase we're going to be using for this application. As I showed you before, fb-a2.firebase.com is our URL. And then next I want to take a look at the template. So this is the application template for the app here. And you can see at the top, we are rendering our login component. And then, Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about some new template syntax that we've got here?
If you're familiar with Angular 1 template syntax, this may look a little bit different too. And even if you're not familiar with Angular 1, this might look a little bit unusual. And we've got a new syntax for Angular 2, and we've got some guides that explain how it works and how to use it that I recommend you look at on angular.io. But I'll focus on some of the interesting things for our application here. The first thing we see is that we see a hash login on the FB login component. So that's the custom component that has the login button and log out your name. What this does is actually that makes that component available inside our template using the name login. So putting hash before something just makes that component available. So other places, if I look down at line 5, where I have login.login state, that's looking at the login state observable on the login component. So we can compose components nicely using that. And then on the left of this element, we see an ng-switch property, and it's also a directive. So what this does is set a property of this element, which there's an ng-switch directive. If you're familiar with Angular 1, we still have a concept of directives that will, the child directives here with ng-switch when will then say, okay, whatever the whatever the value of the login state is, if it matches logged in, then show this element. If it matches not logged in, then show this element that says please log in. And if we don't know the state yet, then we'll say checking authentication.
Yeah, and we're doing the same thing down here to show the chat messages so that we can only display chat messages for logged in users. And this here maps to our messages component. So looking at the login component specifically, I'm just going to touch on a few details here. So we can see that in our constructor, we instantiate this login state property, which Jeff mentioned before, which we just use to keep track of whether a user is logged in or not. And then to set that property, we're using a method directly from the Firebase SDK called onAuth. And this function is triggered anytime the user's authentication state changes. So it'll return some user data if they're authenticated. If not, it will return null. So if state is null, then it will set login state to not logged in. Otherwise, it will set it to logged in. And then we also create this username property, which will keep track of the user's GitHub username so that we can write that data to Firebase, as you saw before, using this user method. And then we just have our login and logout methods here. This is a Firebase-specific method, auth with OAuth popup. And then we pass it the name of the provider we're using, which is GitHub. And that'll return an error or some data from the GitHub API on the authenticated user. And then here's our logout method. And then next, I just want to show you the code where we are writing the data to Firebase. So as Jeff mentioned before, we create a observable here, and we are writing data to the /messages node using Firebase's push method, and we're writing a message and a user.
So in the messages component, if I could pop back really quickly, we have something right here where we have the message form that we registered in our template, and it has a property called ng-submit, which is an observable. And so in here, we're just attaching some combinators. These are like the equivalent of .then in a promise where we can do things in a chain. So first I have this function that marks the input field as pending so that it'll be disabled while we are pushing the value. And then I get the values ready to push to Firebase here with another function. And then on flat map is when I call this handle form submit. Flat map is a way of saying it's like map, except it can, instead of just receiving a synchronous value, it can receive a promise or an observable and wait for that promise or observable to produce a value before it then pushes a value to subscribe. So in the handle form submit function in our service, we're returning an observable that is created from pushing to Firebase because the Firebase web SDK returns promises now. So when I call push, this returns a promise, and then as soon as that resolves or rejects, then my component gets notified and automatically updates itself.
Cool. So we kind of saw how two aspects of the Firebase SDK fit really well with Angular. We talked about the real-time database, and then we saw authentication. The last thing we want to show you is Firebase hosting. So right now, I've just got my app running locally. I'm only chatting with myself. It's not super exciting. But I want all of you to be able to join in the chat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop back over here to my terminal. I'm going to stop the server process and clear out the screen. And what I'm going to use to deploy my application is an Angular CLI add-on that David wrote, which is super awesome. It's called Angular CLI Firebase Hosting. So it makes it really easy to deploy your Angular CLI application using Firebase hosting. The only command I have to run is ng firebase deploy. Once I've set it up, that's really all I have to do. So it's grabbing all my files and putting them into a dist directory, which is what it's going to deploy. It's uploading them. You can see it crank in there, and boom, it's deployed.
And one thing that's interesting about the Angular CLI Firebase deploy, rather than just the Firebase CLI itself, which is pretty simple to use, is this is aware of where your assets go, and so it will actually build your project using Angular CLI and push from the build artifacts to your host, so you don't have to configure and say, where are my dist folder and that kind of thing.
It saves you like
at least
commands.
2 seconds.
Two commands. And it's just, I didn't want to deal with that anymore.
It's a pretty cool add-on.
I couldn't live that way.
I know. I felt sorry for you.
So if you're curious what it did, so it created this, where's my firebase.json file right here? This is a firebase.json file, which tells Firebase hosting which Firebase app I want to deploy and which directory I want to be my root. So that's dist. So you can see it's deploying my dist directory, which has everything bundled up all nicely, thanks to David's awesome CLI add-on. But now let's take a look at the app. So you can all check it out live, fb-a2. www.firebaseapp.com. And you can all go log in and chat with each other. While I'm waiting for you to do that, I'm going to jump back to the slides real quick. Just in case you didn't get the URL, it's fb-a2.firebaseapp.com. You can all go log in with GitHub. I think Jeff and David are doing that right now. Jeff just logged in. Awesome. While people are chatting, I'll leave that open. I'm going to go back to presentation mode briefly. Just want to share all the resources that we talked about with you today. So a link to a demo app that Jeff built, which I based my translations demo app off of, is on his personal GitHub, QA app demo. It's got a couple more components. Great place to go if you want to get started with Firebase and Angular 2. Angular 2's got documentation on angular.io. And if you want to check out the source, github/angular/angular under the Angular org. And then, as I mentioned before, all the docs for Angular 2 are on angular.io. Firebase also has some great documentation on the Firebase website. And if you want to check out Angular Fire 2, that's under the Angular org as well, and Angular Fire 2. And if you're interested in Angular CLI, here are all the relevant links to that, including David's CLI add-on. Anything to add on resources?
That's a lot of resources.
It's a lot. I'll leave this slide up for a moment in case you want to take
homework.
a picture, take some notes. Looks like people
Yeah,
are...
and this will be recorded, so you probably already said that.
It's good chat going on right now.
Nice. So that's all we have for you, but we will take a look at the stream to see if there's any
I don't see
questions.
any questions. Yeah, unless I'm looking at the wrong stream.
That's
Yeah, we're not sure which stream the questions are in, but you are more than welcome to send us stuff on Twitter, drop messages in our, our language preference chat room, or however way you get a hold of us.
We're
We are
checking
more than
Twitter
happy
to
to
see if
answer
there's any
anything.
questions. Don't see any yet, but yeah, as David mentioned, just tweet at any of us and we will answer your questions promptly. I'm gonna jump out of screen sharing mode for a second, go back to video.
Good. I think it was really, really interesting, guys. I really appreciate this this presentation. I have a question for you because I'm a little bit curious about the future of Angular 2. If I can ask you a question.
Yeah, go for it.
So basically, I see that I just did like a quick look a few evenings ago on Angular 2 documentation, and mainly I see that you change slightly the way how you architect the framework. In particular, you are let's say trying to follow some well-consolidated design pattern like the injection, like the observables and stuff like that I already see in other different languages. Are you spotting some huge difference between working with Angular 1 and the approach that Angular 1 has and the new approach that you are using on Angular 2?
As the developer of the framework or as a user?
Yeah, as a developer, yeah.
The observable certainly, I think, simplifies things. Observables are kind of intimidating. There's a lot that they can do. They're really simple concepts, but you can put them together in really interesting ways. And when you start to figure out how to do it, it opens the doors for a lot of powerful things. So actually, like with the HTTP library in Angular 2, it's really simple, and it's really simple because it uses observables, and observables can do a lot of the things that would otherwise be hard, like in Angular 1 HTTP, they were hard. Things like retrying requests and buffering, composing with other things like value change events of form inputs so that you can throttle and debalance
and
cancel work that's happening.
You can even stream data chunks back if the server.
Yeah, so there's a lot you can do with just these really simple paradigms. Dependency injection, yeah, we had that in Angular 1, and we saw a lot of problems with lazy loading with it because we had in Angular 1 we just had a single dependency injector that the whole application would use, and it couldn't change after the application was bootstrapped. So that means if you wanted to load some part of your app later, then you would have to hack around it and create a new injector outside of like the supported Angular path. In Angular 2, it's a lot more dynamic and flexible and hierarchical. So you can just treat your app where you have a single dependency injector and every component just pulls from that same thing. Or in your components, you can define your own, what we call providers, which are just ways of telling Angular how to configure your dependencies. And that component and all its children will then get that provider instead of something declared at the root level. So now you can lazy load components as routes, and so that you don't have to load them at the front of your application. And when that's loaded, it'll figure out what kind of injector it needs, and then we'll create the right stuff. Those are two pretty big changes that we carried over, and that I think are a lot more powerful now.
Any other questions?
Sorry, Sara.
And even as a developer, like using a lot of these new things is really nice, especially the new template syntax, because it sort of enforces a lot of patterns on you. Because like Angular 1 was a lot like, it was kind of like it was just a lot of power, and it was like, go have fun. And then like, don't shoot your eye out. And then now there's a lot of really guided ways, and even just the language or the framework itself sort of guides you down a specific path, which makes things it makes a lot easier to make decisions.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it was easy to misspell something in a template in Angular 1, and you wouldn't know why a directive wasn't working. But now things are more explicit, so Angular can actually log errors and say, you're trying to set a property of a component that I don't know about, or listen to an event. And other than runtime debugging, it also makes tooling more possible. So with IDEs, which we're working with IDEs to get support, and a lot of them have pretty cool implementations coming soon. IDEs can actually see your templates, your HTML templates, and know if you're doing something wrong because you're using Angular's new template syntax, and can show you red squiggly lines or something and say, did you mean this? Or this doesn't exist. So there's a lot of opportunity with our CLI and IDEs to provide a nice developer experience based on the new template syntax.
Nice. And another question that I have is when you're going to release Angular 2?
It's already in beta. What more?
Yeah, in beta.
So in the blog post where we announced beta, we outlined all the things that we still want to make great before we call it general availability. So router, we've still got some work, HTTP library, internationalization, accessibility, animations, and better documentation, which I think we have pretty good docs so far. We've got a lot of folks working on great guides. API reference we're still filling out. But we had a pretty high bar for what we considered beta for Angular 2. And so what we consider that is that we have a stable core that we don't expect major breaking changes to. It's already well tested with apps inside Google. We've got hundreds of developers already building with Angular 2 and have been for several months. So it's a pretty solid foundation, and we just want to fill out the other pieces before we call it general stable.
Okay, there is a question. Why we use the RxJS in sample application?
That's what Angular uses. So Angular actually depends on RxJS. We have some parts of Angular that, like the form we saw where it has an ng-submit property that is an observable. That's an RxJS observable. And HTTP produces observables. And we're more places in Angular, we're going to be adding observables so that you have more of an observable way, a reactive way to do certain things instead of a callback-driven way, which is what's supported right now. So yeah, that's why it's in the application. It's what Angular 2 is using as the observable implementation.
Cool. I think that there isn't any other question. So thank you very much, guys, for your time. I hope that you enjoyed the experience, and I hope to see you again maybe in the next webinar around Angular 2, maybe.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And yeah, definitely find us on Twitter if you have any follow-up questions. We're happy to chat with you.
Definitely. So for the other guys that are that are following us, tomorrow we will have another meetup. This time is a live meetup that will happen here in London. So you can see all the information on meetup.com. And thank you very much for following us, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks, Luca.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good night.
And you. Cheers.